Bienvenue.
Welcome, welcome. Willkommen, willkommen. Tervetuola, Bures Boatin. Welcome to this 9th edition of the festival, and thank you to the city of Fontainebleau for welcoming us in such a beautiful theater. With the subject chosen, the people, an invitation was given to the 5 Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. The Ministry of Culture and the Scientific Committee, under the auspices of President Pierre Osenberg, wanted to send a strong signal. The history of art must be linked to the themes, questions, and issues which animate today's society. It must contribute to a better understanding and knowledge of art and the cultural heritage of all countries. The mission of this festival, which is supported by the National Institute for Art History and which is responsible for its historic program, working with museums, research centers in France, and the Château de Fontainebleau, which is responsible for hosting the festival, the valuation of its heritage as well. Our mission is to share the work that is done by art historians everywhere in France and elsewhere outside of these walls. We, in fact, are interested in all kinds of issues which are raised by artistic and cultural objects. But this interest would be limited in meaning if we were not to share it with the public at large. As in previous years, the festival will offer you a broad choice of debates, conferences, films, exhibits, art magazines, concerts, and visits. And this year, I hope that you will be able to discover in these 3 days a very rich and stimulating offer. With our new team under the presidency of Bruno Vazim, we have continued the work that was done by Annick Lemoine and Pierre Rosenberg, and we thank you for that. But we also wanted to have a few other elements stressed here, and you will be able to discover this. We felt it was important to associate even more students to our work. We felt that it was important to be interested in all geographies and to invite artists to participate directly in this festival. The cooperation with our Nordic colleagues was a real source of pleasure. We thank them for their enthusiasm and their support, and for coming here in such great numbers. We are excited and are waiting to listen to you to learn about the history of art in your respective countries and region. We would like to thank, on behalf of all of my colleagues of the INHA and the Chateau, we would like to thank all of the partners, old and new, for your enthusiasm and support. You are numerous. The festival is a collective event, and everyone wants to participate. It's a real challenge and a real source of pleasure. This year, the festival is opening with a Danish artist, Danh Võ, who's hiding behind the curtains. He has chosen, in fact, to be here with you today to speak to you in the form of a dialogue. He is a very important artist who rarely speaks in public. His retrospective at the Guggenheim Museum in New York was of real revelation of both of how collective and personal histories merge. And he shows us how art and history cannot be thought of separately. The dialogue will take place with Joshua ChambersLetson, who's an associate professor at Northwestern University. It will take place in English. They will speak of Danh Võ's trajectory of his project, his artistic project, maybe his more intimate projects as well. His work is still to be discovered. It was at the Biennale in Venice, so it's a great honor for us to have him here today. He is inaugurating this festival, so I welcome these two artists, Dan and Joshua, on stage.
Thank you so much for joining us from so far. The platform is all yours.
Thank you. Bonjour.
Good morning.
Apologize. For those of you, one thing, our friends in the translation booth have informed me that French is quite more an elegant language than English and requires me to slow down. So if I sound a little sleepy for those of you who speak English, please know that we do this out of deference for my own linguistic failures in relation to French. For those of you who are familiar with Jan's practice, Jan often curates a space with found objects and the work of collaborators. And in the spirit of his practice, he has asked me to begin today with the performance of this text, which is in every way a dialogue with his work. Jan Vaux's 2009 exhibition at the Kunsthalle Basel, a floating chandelier and a gravestone, are the sole performers in a grand room. The room, august with sunlight pouring in from the outside. The chandelier, majestic, glittering, crystal teardrops spilling from one tear to the next. The gravestone, a replica of the facade of a washing machine, refrigerator, television, and crucifix cast in bronze, marble, granite, and wood relief. So much beauty, not much life. Performance is imbued with a weak power of resurrection. In performance, we can conjure the past and bring it back into the present. Performance, in other words, has the power to make more life. Today, I offer a series of scenes on the work of Jan Vaux in an attempt to describe this power while underscoring its necessity in a world where death and destruction are commonly and unjustly distributed to minoritarian subjects, by which I mean people of color, women, queers, and trans folk, immigrants and refugees, the colonized, deported, and dispossessed, the minor, marginal, and the often forgotten. My aim today is to paint a portrait of performance's power to keep our dead alive and with us as we fight to survive a relentlessly precarious present. So, and to quote the rapper Drake, good morning, good afternoon, and good night. I'm here to talk about more life. German Jewish philosopher Walter Benjamin completed the theses on the philosophy of history shortly before committing suicide at the Franco-Spanish border, fearing that he would be turned over to the Nazis as he attempted escape. Written before death, the essay labors in the service of more life, as Benjamin desperately calls for a historian who will brush history against the grain in order to give an historical account from the position of the present and from the perspective of the oppressed. This figure would recognize that since history is written by the victors, there is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. And just as such a document is not free of barbarism, barbarism taints also the manner in which it is transmitted from one owner to another. Vaux performs the role of the historian, and to get a sense of what I mean by this, let's track one chandelier as it was transmitted from one owner to another before appearing before you in a gallery or museum. It originally hung in the ballroom of the Hotel Majestic in Paris, where it was witness to any number of events, including, on January 27th, 1973, the signature of the Paris Peace Accords. The Accords began the process of ending the Vietnam War, which concluded with the fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975. In the aftermath of the war, in the southeast Vietnamese town of Ba Ria, a little boy dies. He was one of over 1 million Vietnamese people whose lives were claimed by the war and its immediate aftermath. His mother, Hao Thi Nguyen, was at the time pregnant with his brother, Vo Trung Kian, later Yan Vo. If they needed a moment to pause and to reflect on the past, remembering the losses incurred during and now after the war, Vo's family was almost immediately exposed to a new regime of forced forgetting. Like the revolutionary regimes established in neighboring Cambodia and Laos, the Khmer Rouge and the Pathet Lao, the new Vietnamese government attempted to correct a past it believed to be tainted with colonialism and capitalism through violent practices of forced erasure. In essence, writes Southeast Asian Studies scholar Kataria what was sought by revolutionary transformation under Southeast Asian communism was not simply the destruction of the old societal structure, but a whole way of life, submitted to a system that sought the ultimate severance from the past. Social memory was systematically undermined as the regimes worked to revolutionize language, culture, and traditions, and to destroy what they could not transform or suppress. Survival under such regimes often required forgetting, if not outright fugitivity. About 4 years after Yan was born, his parents made the decision to join an exodus of approximately 1 million refugees who left Vietnam by boat. 1 million dead in the war, and now 1 million adrift at sea. The family left aboard a handmade boat collectively built under the supervision of Yan's father, Phung. Around this time, many of Vietnam's neighbors began closing their doors to the growing tides of Vietnamese refugees. Some were saved, but many more were returned to the sea by Thai and Malaysian officials. They were left adrift atop the ocean, exposed to a prolonged, painful, and desperate death. In the words of performance studies scholar Patricia Nguyen, the refugees surviving atop the oceans lived and live with no closure, no finality, only an intensity built to a painful silence of drifting. It is adrift on the boat where refugees with bodies stacked upon one another are caught on the brink of drowning and floating across the ocean. Many still live in the wake of this drift, haunted by the memories of what it took to stay alive and of what they lost in the process. If the ocean threatened oblivion, those who survived often encountered new forms of erasure and forgetting when they reached new shores. As teaches us, In the United States, Southeast Asian refugees often feel the oppressive weight of a history that receives little public acknowledgement, their losses and sacrifices expunged by the amnesia of a nation entangled in its own self-deception, culpability, and guilt. Though they were settled in Europe, Jan's own family was also subject to new official regimes of erasure and forced forgetting. There is not a document of civilization that is not, at the same time, a record of barbarism, not even a passport, as Vaux reminds us through the reproduction of his first passport photograph. Following a stay in a Singaporean refugee camp, much of the family was resettled in Denmark. Though he was born Vaux Trung Ki Yang, the Danish officials handling his passport erroneously transformed his official name into Jan Vaux. So if Jan's family lost a son in the aftermath of the war, as they survived the aftermath of the aftermath, Danish authorities legally killed their second son, Vaux Trung Ki Jan, to give birth to Jan Vaux. As curator Catherine Brinson astutely notes, this literal restructuring by state authority of a central pillar of his self-definition has been inscribed in the artist's identity ever since, his official papers continuing to bear the trace of bureaucratic indifference to cultural alterity. Vaux commonly transforms official documents into works of art, moving between mass catastrophes such as the Vietnam War or the AIDS crisis, and the minutiae of bureaucratic life, as in a marriage certificate. These moves highlight the fact that we live in an era where states manage and discipline life both biopolitically and necropolitically. The biopolitical referring here to Michel Foucault's term for the state's management and protection of the biological life of its population. The necropolitical referring here to Achille Mbembe's description of the state's exposure of specific segments of a given population to death, often under the auspices of protecting a preferred part of the body politic. Under these conditions, bureaucratic indifference is active, violent, destructive, and creative. The creative and destructive force of bureaucratic indifference is written across the banker's signature as it secures a line of credit to build a fleet of ships to carry slaves from the west coast of Africa to Europe, to the Americas, to Saint-Domingue, Haiti. It's the transportation secretary's executive order ensuring the trains are moving on time as they transport living cargo to death camps. And it's the act of carelessly stripping the name from a little boy adrift in the wake of war. In one of Vaux's works, Bureaucratic Indifference is a 1975 letter from United States Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to American theater critic Leonard Lyon, wherein Kissinger complains, "I would choose your ballets over contemplating Cambodia any day if only I were given the choice." Staging Kissinger's letter within a context flush with the memories of the forgotten war, Vaux reminds us that the Secretary's assertion of powerlessness is facetious at best and only plausible if one forgets that the choices made by Kissinger and other architects of the war directly affected the shape, scope, and quality of life and death in Cambodia and Vietnam. Indeed, around the time he wrote the letter, Kissinger told Thai Foreign Minister Chatichai Chunhavan, "You should also tell the Cambodians that we will be friends with them. They are murderous thugs, but we won't let that stand in our way. We are prepared to improve relations with them." Satisfied that the Khmer Rouge were antagonistic to the Vietnamese government, and in an effort to improve relations with the Cambodian regime, The Nixon administration played an active role in discrediting the memories and traumatic recollections of Cambodian refugees escaping across the Cambodian border into Thailand. Refugees in need of help were left exposed to death as the U.S. gave the regime cover while they carried out their systematic murder of approximately 1/3 of the country's 5 million person population in 4 short years. Refugees of the Vietnam War remain subject to the brutal tides of remembering a history that still hurts, while caught in the wake of the strong currents of enforced and private forgetting. But the little boy, renamed by Danish authorities, never forgot who he was, where he came from, or what his family lost in their flight across the ocean to find more life. He became an artist, and in 2009 he purchased the chandeliers at auction, naming each for the precise moment that it was deinstalled and became the possession of a Vietnamese refugee. Like Benjamin's historian, Vo is armed with the powerful knowledge that every document of civilization is at the same time a document of barbarism. He collects and gathers these objects together, putting them to work, making them perform the dark histories that cling to them. A curator recently told me that museums are mausoleums. They take objects out of circulation from the world of the living, preserving and conserving them for contemporary reflection and future disuse. I told him this was preposterous and dangerously irresponsible. A museum doesn't contain and conserve dead objects. It captures objects that the living have charged with all kinds of vitality, force, and power, knowing these powers can be deployed in the service of the museum's mission. Museums don't house dead objects, they stage performances. What Vo understands, and what he wants you to know too, is that every object in a museum is a performance artist. To say that an artwork performs is to recognize that the encounter with a work of art is always a relational scene in which meaning is produced in the interaction between the work and the spectator. As much as a viewer brings their own perspective and set of knowledge to the animation of the work, the object always brings its own investments, references, and histories to the encounter. Which is to say that as the chandelier interacts with the spectator, and as the spectator produces meaning in the encounter with the chandelier performs for, or better put, with the spectator. But there is also the fact that art objects are not fixed, durable, unmoving things. Rather, they're events slowly unfolding in front of us. They decay and rot, transform and warp, changing in often minute and imperceptible ways. For Benjamin, the unique existence of a work of art includes the changes which it may have suffered in physical condition over the years, as well as the various changes in ownership. Sculptures, paintings, drawings, and other durable art objects might thus be better described as durational performance. Just over a year ago, I made my way through the current exhibition's manifestation of the Guggenheim Museum in New York, and I noticed a number of Vo's works exposed to the elements. He requested the removal of the museum's oculus, bathing the galleries in light that is as beautiful as it is destructive. Sunlight illuminates, but it also burns, eating away at paper documents and printed matter. My guide, Christina Young, told me of the challenges faced by the museum's conservation team, who knew or worried that a number of works would be degraded by their exposure to this light, the air, the elements, or the people moving through the museum. Vo's insistence on displaying them in exposed and vulnerable states underscores his conception of these works as events performing and transforming before us as they live out the extended process of decay and slow death. Benjamin suggests that the source of an artwork's vital force is its aura. This aura is drawn from or supplied by the places and owners through which an object has passed, or what Sarah Ahmed describes as an object's background, which could be best described as a history of changing hands. A work of art can shimmer with the lingering life force of the person who made it, traditionally secured by the artist's signature. The artist extends a portion of her life to the things that she makes, or as Karl Marx wrote, describing another scene of production. In the production of the coat, human labor power in the shape of tailoring has, in actual fact, been expended. Human labor has therefore been accumulated in the coat. Within the capitalist mode of production, the portion of a worker's life force transferred to the object she makes is sold away from her at greater price than she was paid to make it. And for Marx, this means that the life which she has conferred on the object now confronts her as something hostile and alien to her. And indeed, as a commodity is alienated from the worker and moves through circulation, it is often stripped of its background and renamed, like the refugee whose name and story is rewritten when his stateless body is shuttled around the world by any host of bureaucratic processes, which is to say that the vital force of the worker who made the object, or the context in which the object was made, can be scrubbed from the object and forgotten as it moves through the world. But in performance, that which is lost can be reanimated or restored, and to radical effect. The chandelier bears two signatures. There is the signature that speaks of its role as a witness to this historic event that led to Vaux's oceanic exodus. But there is also Vaux's signature as artist, which signifies his mediation of the object, as his touch transforms it from merely a document of civilization into a vitally charged work of art. Vaux's hand may never touch the objects he places on display, but by way of the assignation of his signature and his subsequent curation of the object, the chandelier begins to perform a memorial function by remembering who and what it is. Asian American studies scholars Fiona Ngo, Mimi Ting Nguyen, and Mariam Lam have argued that remembrance is, of course, a particular problem after the devastation wrought by colonialism and war, and as such is less a recovery than a refusal to move on, which is to say, leave behind. The performance of remembrance can be a means of refusing to move on, which is what affords performance the power to keep the dead alive as we resist the call to leave them behind. Performance is thus, in the language of performance theorist Rebecca Schneider, an act of survival, of keeping alive as passing on in multiple senses of the phrase to pass. Performance can be the radical act of refusing to move on in an attempt to keep the dead alive, preserving along with them their angry and insurgent demands for justice. Objects have long played a role in keeping the dead alive. One might think here of the gravestone Vaux designed for his grandmother, tombstone for Nguyen T.T. After surviving their exodus from Vietnam, Nguyen T.T. was settled in Germany, though Jan and his siblings and parents were taken to Denmark. A German immigrant relief program gave his grandmother a refrigerator, washing machine, and television. The Catholic Church provided a cross. Vaux later transformed new versions of these gifts into the statue Oma Totem, which became the template for the tombstone he designed for his grandmother. These gifts were meant to facilitate the break between a refugee's past and her smooth entry into the new terrain of subjectivity produced by and for European capitalist modernity. They are a literal materialization of what Mimi Ting Nguyen describes as the gift of freedom, whereby freedom figures as an impossible promise that justifies U.S. and European imperialism or the expansion of capitalism and attendant forms of capitalist exploitation. Since freedom within liberalism is commonly conceived of as a right or property, the gift, writes Nguyen, as the transfer of a possession from one to another, shapes a relation between giver and recipient, and engenders a debt, which is to say that the gift belongs to an economy that voids its open-handed nature. Indeed, the gift conscripts the recipient into capital's economy of exploitative labor. Dominant narratives of Vietnamese refugees commonly frame them as passive recipients of the gift of freedom. Following Yen Liaspiritu, by portraying the Vietnamese as a desperate people fleeing a desperate country, such narratives produce the Vietnamese worker to be naturally suited and even grateful to work in boring, repetitive, monotonous, low-paid, and insecure jobs. The refugee, once bestowed with the gift, must begin the endless work of working to repay that which can never be repaid, because it is that which exceeds all price, freedom. Having received the gift of freedom, the refugee is expected to forget her past and place whatever traumas she has survived to the side as she commits herself to becoming a productive, working member of her adopted homeland. The commodities gifted to Vau's grandmother betray the gendered assumptions about the type of reproductive labor that a refugee may be called upon to perform in order to pay back the gift incurred by freedom's gift. A refrigerator, a washing machine, a television, a cross. To cook and clean, consume, and then give thanks for your perdition. This is the path through which the condescension of freedom's gift puts a refugee's past under erasure as she is made into a modern, gendered subject of and for capital. But transforming these commodities into both a sculpture and then a gravestone, Vau's tombstone for Nguyen T. speaks less of a life lived in freedom than in refuge, telling a story of the forms of social and historical death to which refugees are subject when they are stripped of their pasts and put to work in the service of your present. Still, when mourners encounter the tombstone for Nguyen T. at Nguyen's grave, it stands in her place, performing in her absence, but keeping apart some part of her, alive, extending and giving her more life in the presence of a mourner's present. To be honest, Vaux is himself kind of a transactional performance artist, deploying the queer art of seduction to woo wealthy patrons and art institutions into giving him money, with which he in turn buys up the revered documents of the colonizers' history to sell them back at a dearer price. But before he does, he coaxes these documents of your so-called civilization into speaking of their once and ongoing barbarism. In the words of Brinson, citing in turn Vaux's own description of his process, he often does so as a means to force an antagonistic system to produce and register my private memories. But if, to return to Benjamin's phrasing, barbarism taints also the manner in which it was transmitted from one owner to another, when Vaux gains possession of the objects, he gains the power to take revenge on the object for its previous owner's crimes. In Mother Tongue, Vaux's 2013 exhibition at the Marion Goodman Gallery in New York, a spectator came into the gallery through elevators, first walking by the print, before entering an exhibition space filled with an array of items, including shipping boxes adorned in gold leaf and calligraphy done by his father, as well as objects that Vaux acquired at auction. Most of these things passed through the hands of U.S. presidents, military leaders, and diplomats during the Vietnam War era, including especially items that once belonged to Robert S. McNamara, U.S. Secretary of Defense from 1961 to 1968. They range from a pair of chairs that sat in the Kennedy Cabinet Room, a letter from a recently widowed Jacqueline Kennedy to McNamara, 4 pens used to sign appropriation bills that made the Vietnam War possible, and an Orientalist curio, such as a Vietnamese carved ivory tusk or a set of African masks that were collected personally by McNamara. As the objects that Vaux curates into the room speak to and with each other and the spectator, the history of a bloody war that might be forgotten but not gone comes back to life across the pristine white walls of Goodman's gallery. In mother tongue, the necropolitical landscapes of the Vietnam War and the ghosts of Vietnamese people murdered during the war are referenced and reproduced through a gesture to their absence. This is probably most explicit with the staging of Lot 20, 2 Kennedy administration cabinet room chairs, in which Vaux calls for the vengeance of the murdered Vietnamese people. Near the front of the gallery and cast in soft light from the window to its left, a skeletal mahogany chair frame faces a white wall. On its right side, the tattered white muslin upholstery that was once affixed to the chair is suspended from another wall. And across the gallery, a pile of cotton stuffing and upholstery nails ripped from the chair are heaped in a pile on the floor and displayed a few feet from David Wojnarowicz's iconic Untitled Buffalo, 1988, the gesture to 2 other massacres, the murder of indigenous peoples in the Americas and the murder of gays during the AIDS crisis of the 1980s. Elsewhere in the gallery hangs Lot 20 autographed letter, a presentation signed by Jacqueline Kennedy, a handwritten note to McNamara from the recently widowed First Lady. In the note, Kennedy discloses her desire to give you something special of Jack's that would mean something to you. Ultimately, she settles on this chair before writing, "You are the only member of this cabinet who will have a chair he sat in during Jack's administration." Lacking only a photograph of the chair gifted to McNamara, the interplay between the chair and Kennedy's note issues a playful reproduction of Joseph Kossuth's 1 and 3 chairs. As the spectator moves between the chair and Kennedy's letter, the two come into conversation with each other. The chair from Lot 20 comes back to life and dances before the spectator as if it were this chair performing in a fashion that reanimates and reproduces the trace of the lives of Robert, Jackie, and Jack. Taking into his possession the priceless and cherished artifacts of the colonizer, such as these chairs, Vaux destroys them, ripping them apart and fragmenting them as if in violent recompense for the way the colonizers destroyed, ripped apart, and fragmented life in Vietnam before, during, and after the war. These iconoclastic acts of desecration are performed in the names of the dead, functioning as vengeful, decolonial gestures of remembrance that refuse to move on, which is to say, leave behind, as if to say, I remember, and we remember. These tiny destructive rebellions performed in the service of memory and more life. Or maybe the act of tearing apart the colonizer's cherished memory is an echo of another gesture of anti-colonial, corporeal desecration. Let's say you are walking into Vaux's home in Berlin for the first time. You pass through the front doorway into a vestibule where you are immediately confronted on your left with a painting that Vaux has more than once curated into his exhibitions. It's a 19th century painting from Vietnam. Against a blue landscape, a ring of Vietnamese soldiers rip apart the body of a French missionary. Limbs are hewn from limbs. Organs spill out on the sacrificial table, and a white man's head drips blood onto the stump of what used to be his lower arm and hand. a ring of soldiers looks on as a final concentric circle of Vietnamese civilians take in the scene of the missionaries' subjection. In the era before the French laid brutal claim to the land and lives of the Vietnamese people from the 19th to mid-20th century, the Vietnamese crown, recognizing the soft colonial threat of Christian missionaries, banned these armies of conversion from Vietnamese soil. But ever since the Treaty of Westphalia defined the proper province of national sovereignty by limiting it to the provincial terrain of Europe, European sovereigns gave themselves the right to respect the West and conquer the rest, refusing to recognize the sovereign right of people and places in Asia, Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. We might then think of this historical act of tearing apart the colonizer's body alongside Vaux's desecration of McNamara's chair, or even the body of liberty herself, as if to repay the gift of freedom by tearing apart the body of the white monster bearing this so-called gift. From 2011 to 2016, Vaux employed the services of a Shanghai manufacturer to create an exact replica of all the various components comprising the Statue of Liberty. The pieces are never to be assembled, displayed in their various fragments and strewn across the world. Vaux, in other words, has torn the body of liberty from limb to limb. Now here is what every American child is taught about the Statue of Liberty. The French people, themselves committed to the ideas of liberté, égalité, fraternité, were so enamored of America's fullest realization of the ideals of liberty that they gave the Americans the gift of a goddess who would forever enshrine those ideas in the form of her body. Dedicated on October 28, 1886, the statue was designed by French sculptor Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi with a metal framework built by Gustave Eiffel. The statue was installed in what would be called Liberty Island, just beside Ellis Island, a primary processing center for immigrants to the U.S., and itself a site for the brutal and common dehumanization of European immigrants. But it was not the struggle of immigrants that gave birth to the idea of the statue. Rather, the statue was proposed by Édouard René de la Boulaye, president of the French Anti-Slavery Society, to honor the abolition of slavery in the U.S. following the events of the American Civil War, which concluded in 1865. This detail, I should note, is not commonly taught to school children in America, which rarely recognizes its unpayable debt to the 60 million and more that it kidnapped and birthed into the horrors of U.S. race slavery, including my great-great-great-grandmother and great-great-great-grandfather. And it seems notable that the French made no offer of a great goddess of liberty to the people of Haiti, who emancipated themselves from the brutal and violent domination of French colonial rule, which lasted from 1625 to 1805, an act for which the Western world has never forgiven Haiti or its children. Indeed, the French repaid the enslaved rebels acts of liberté, égalité, and fraternité by imprisoning the heroic leader of the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint L'Ouverture, who was arrested by French colonial authorities in 1802 and transported here to France, where he died in a French prison on August 7th, 1803. The cause of his death is unknown. He was another victim of the French gift of freedom, alongside the millions of black people who had been burned and buried alive, suffered amputated limbs, or were whipped to tattered flesh, mutilated, raped, or worse by the French colonial regime under the legislative authority of Louis XIV's Code Noir. Indeed, as a former slave in the colonies once recalled, have they not hung up men with heads downward, drowned them in sacks, crucified them on planks, buried them alive, crushed them in mortars? Have they not forced them to eat excrement? And having flayed them with the lash, have they not cast them alive to be devoured by worms, or onto ant hills, or lashed them to the stakes in the swamps to be devoured by mosquitoes? Have they not thrown them into boiling cauldrons of cane syrup? Have they not put men and women inside barrels studded with spikes and rolled them down mountainsides into the abyss? Have they not consigned these miserable blacks to the dogs until the latter, sated by human flesh, left the mangled victims to be finished by bayonet or poignée? A legacy of this history of black flesh torn asunder is that black people across the world live today with the knowledge that the bodies of black people may still be subject to all forms of desecration, from being shot in the street by police officers and civilians when walking freely in the streets of a so-called free America, to being denied entry to Europe as new waves of African refugees seek safe harbor in the European Union in the contemporary moment. Where Vaux's family found safe harbor on the decks of a European ship, today's refugees are exposed to death, detention. They are deemed unworthy of the gift of freedom. We, the people, those vaunted words that introduce and give legitimacy to the project of the U.S. Constitution, is not an inclusive concept. A people is always defined by who lies outside of its boundaries of inclusion, beyond the limits of proper personhood, as the European masters conceived of it for themselves and denied it to the colonized and enslaved. We, the people, is a concept that could only be imagined alongside the refusal and violent denial of humanity to large numbers of people of color, to African and Black American slaves, indigenous people, African, Asian, and Latino immigrants, refugees, and colonial subjects. Vaux's materialization of we the people, in which the various fragments of the body of this goddess of liberty remain torn asunder, incomplete, spread around the world and never to be put together, which suggests that the ideal of liberté, égalité, and fraternité is most palpable in the form of its spectacularly failed promise. Its promise, its failure to cohere, not an incomplete project waiting to be completed, but a project that was never meant to be complete for everyone. Here, Vaux takes vengeance on the myth of Euro-American freedom and finally gives France and the United States a proper image of what liberté, égalité, and fraternité has actually been for all too many of us: bodily dispossession, violence against the flesh, the undoing of sovereignty, and the denial of a promise that we were never meant to hear. We might all end in vengeance, but not today. For Vaux's work also stages more life as a practice of living on and keeping each other alive when both seem structurally impossible. I am you, you are too is a shrine to more life, staged at the Guggenheim Museum in New York, which features the personal effects of Florence Wong Fee and her son, the late artist Martin Wong. Florence and Vaux collaborated as he curated items for the piece, which is estimated to contain from 35,000 to 4,000 objects, the personal effects of Wong and his mother. In I Am You, You Are Too's world of 4,000 things, a son and his possessions, from knickknacks and antiques to his own paintings, blend into the mother. The title is drawn from a collection of characters, I am you, you are too, that Martin printed on the back of his business cards and sometimes included in paintings. When spoken aloud, they sound the phrase, I am you, you are too, in which the concrete opposition between I and you fades away for a second, reminding us of the blur between self and other, subject and object, I and you, child and mother. It is this blur that allows us to take our loved ones inside of us, carrying them within us in the wake of their departures and performing their resurrection from a present from which they have been otherwise denied entry. Martin Wong died on August 12, 1999, one of an entire generation of queers and trans people of color who died during the first wave of the AIDS crisis, who were left to die during the first wave of the AIDS crisis. Raised in the Bay Area, he was an active contributor to the legendary queer performance group Angels of Light and the Coquettes before moving his practice to New York, where he became the Chino Malo, as his Nuyorican neighbors called him. He's best known as a painter of the brown undercommons of Loaí Saída and Chinatown, where he often lived, collaborated, and fucked with poet and playwright Miguel Piñero. But while battling the later stages of AIDS, Wong returned to San Francisco to live with his parents and die amidst him and his mother's collection. Florence brought Martin into the world, and through her care work, she carried him out of it. In the afterlife of Martin's afterlife, Florence continued the hard work of keeping her son's legacy alive. She became an archivist of his things, preserving the objects he touched and made in order to sustain him in an unfolding now to which he could not otherwise be present. In a 2010 letter written to Sergio Bessa, then director of programs at the Bronx Museum of the Arts, Florence lists a diverse catalog of Martin's work while expressing her desire to help the Bronx Museum to collect more of my son's paintings. She reminds Bessa that Martin did more than just painting. He made woodcuts and prints, drawings, and ceramics, poems, scrolls, poem books. And she also includes a description of some of the various items from his and their collection. I got a house full of collections. People come here, they think our house looks like a small museum. In an essay on I Am You, You Are Too, artist and Vaux's collaborator Julie Alt writes that Florence Wong Fee's house is devoted to preserving and displaying everything that is Martin Wong and the myriad collections that Martin and she accumulated. Performing as both archive and repertoire, Florence has labored to keep Martin alive in the wake of the unthinkability of his premature death. As she has for decades, Alt continues, Florence fastidiously catalogs every moment in Martin's career and wholeheartedly greets curators, researchers, old friends, and new enthusiasts of Martin's work, making the material collection available for research and narrating the trajectories of what resides together in the house. In spite of Martin and Florence's closeness, Martin's sexuality lived behind a veil of prohibitive silence. This silence must have been painful for him to endure, as it often is for many queers and trans people of color who accept some form of prohibition in order to sustain relationships with our biological families, who sustain us in the face of the battering forces of white supremacy, colonization, displacement, deportation, or dispossession. One result of this legacy is that Wong's expressly sexual queer work remains largely unknown. They are rarely exhibited publicly, primarily held in private collections, as with this painting held in Jan's own home. As Jan told me, Martin never painted something he did not see himself, and it is not a picture of Popeye, but a picture of Popeye's tattoos on one of Martin's lovers. These pieces are rarely exhibited, seemingly more palatable cityscapes take center stage in public and museum walls. Refusing this erasure, Vaux has mined Wong's archive to bring this work to light, as in this piece where Vaux replicates a photograph of a series of long-ago destroyed Wong paintings that depict the erotic violence of a white supremacist carceral regime. Collaborating with Florence in spite of her self-imposed prohibition on Martin's sexuality, Vaux reminds us that as she worked to sustain her son and keep his legacy alive after his death, Florence couldn't help but sustain the imperiled force and vision of queer brown desire that animates so much of his practice. And charged with the life force of the people who once owned the objects which it is comprised, I am you, you are too, now performs the continued work of keeping this and Martin and Florence alive and here still here and still. During a 2014 installation at the Jumex Foundation in Mexico City, a chandelier floats in a white room. It hovers just a small distance above the off-white wooden floors, suspended from a metal chain that is wrapped around industrial rigging, which stretches down from a glowing white ceiling. The weight of the chandelier must be considerable, and the line is drawn taut. If just one chain link should give, the entire thing will come crashing to the ground, shattering and flickering out of being. But instead, it floats there, held up and carrying with it its history, which lingers and stays here still. Sustained by its performance, today, the chandelier carries with it the trace of a little boy who died in a small town in southeast Vietnam, who would never get to meet his baby brother, though his baby brother and family never forgot him. And as it performs today, now, perhaps it too holds some faint memory of Nguyen Thi Thi, Toussaint Louverture, and Martin Wong as well. Performance can be an act of remembrance and of sustaining life, a reparative practice through which we keep our dead alive and through which we pull ourselves together enough to weather the storm another night so we can sustain the fight the morning after. It doesn't always succeed. Most of the time, it will not. But when you haven't got anything else, it's the most that you can do to stay alive. And we need more life. So I believe the conversation has already begun. Jan speaks through his work, and this dialogue has been in dialogue with his work, but I believe we now have time for open questions. Do we?
No. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, we meant to make that clear. That's questions from you. If none, that's okay too. We know there's wine nearby.
Yeah, then I just have the last word, I guess. You know, there's nothing more privileged as an artist to have somebody make use of your work, which is what you have been doing. And thank you for that, Joshua. And thanks for the invitation.
Do we go?
Je pense que, voilà, Danh Võ nous a parlé sans parler.
Well, I think that Vo has talked to us without speaking. I think it's very strong. I think we need to see it as a performance. His work was there, but it's mostly an invitation to reflect upon what objects may do. The fact he was there, his silent presence should be seen that way. Thank you very much.